History's strange, it's alien, and it won't give us what we would like to have.
The McPherson Financial Group brings you hour 3 of a Tuesday morning, this 26th of August, 2025. Headline at BillMick.com, American government, is this how this works? And we kicked that around in our last hour. Didn't get through all the topics that raised the question. We will save those for our wide open Wednesday tomorrow. You can follow WMMB on Instagram at WMMB Radio. And in these Tuesdays at 8 o'clock, Dave Bowman, who is with us on these Tuesdays, brings us Dave Does History, our Liberty 250 series, taking us to the 250th anniversary of this country next July. Dave, where are we living today, my friend?
It might seem like a strange place to start, but there is a film called National Treasure, starring Nicolas Cage, Diane Kruger, a few other people. And oddly enough, it's one of my favorite films. It's a film that if it's on, I watch it. Beautifully filmed. It shows you a lot of interesting places. The history in it is complete and utter nonsense. Don't know actual history in the film, but it is a pretty entertaining film, and I do enjoy it. There's a scene in this film in which Ben Gates, played by Nicolas Cage, and Riley go to the National Archives, and they look at the Declaration of Independence. And in that scene, Ben Gates says these words, quote, "There's a line here that's at the heart of all the others. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, invents a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and provide new guards for their future security," unquote, unquote. Now, he uses that line as justification for stealing the Declaration of Independence, which is on the movie. He's completely wrong, both morally and logically, but he is not wrong about the fact that this line is at the heart of all the others. We've talked over the past couple of weeks about how Congress has shifted the focus from this argument over taxes and Parliament to an argument over the king. The king is being a despot. The king is being a tyrant. The king is doing all this other stuff. And to that end, to the modern reader of the Declaration of Independence, you're going to pick up on that very quickly. Oh, the king has done this. We're getting ready to go into these 27 grievances. The king has refused to do this. The king has refused to do all this other stuff. And all of this stuff makes him a tyrant. And it invents a design, invents being a great English word that means to show clearly. It clearly shows a purpose, a design to reduce us under despotism, absolute despotism. And therefore, we have a right, we have a duty to throw off such government. If we're going to understand the impact of that phrase, we got to roll the clock back. We got to go all the way back long before 1776. We got to go back almost 100 years before that. In fact, more than 100 years before that, when the English underwent what is commonly known as the English Civil War. And in the English Civil War, you have all kinds of brouhaha going on. But perhaps, I guess, the most interesting thing about the English Civil War is that when it started, King Charles I was 5'6" tall. And when it ended, he was only 4'8".
4'8". Okay. And we continue and see what Dave's talking about in 60 seconds on WMMB. And you can make WMMB that number one preset, as many of you have already done. We are the number one preset on the iHeartRadio app here in the market. You can also save What the Frock, Dave Does History, Bill Mick Live, and Florida Roundtable podcast at the top of the app as your presets. So they're right there at the top of the app when you're ready to go. So, he gets shorter or loses something along the way, Dave.
So if you start with James I, yes, that James I, your 1611 King James Version Bible, James I, King of England, used to like to brag that he sat on God's throne, which is kind of a weird way to say that, but he believed that Parliament's main job was to provide him with money so that he could go off and do his thing. His son, Charles I, carried that even further. He fought again and again with Parliament over taxes and money and religion because he was Catholic, the limits of his authority. He dissolved Parliament multiple times, and this eventually results in the English Civil War in the 1640s. Parliament raises an army against the king. The king raises armies against Parliament. They have a big old war. And in 1649, Charles went from 5'6" to 4'8" because he lost not just the war, but the English Parliament cut his head off. So we're done with you. No more. Now, what followed was not stable. The Cromwellian Republic was not satisfactory. It had lots of problems. We don't have time to go through all that. But in the midst of all this, a guy by the name of Sir Robert Filmer was writing a book, and he was an absolute monarchist. And he wrote a book defending the idea that the monarch must be absolute. And he based this in biblical terms, Bill. He said that kings are descended directly from Adam's authority. Adam, of course, created by God, and that therefore political power was just like fatherhood. It's absolute, unquestioned, and ordained by God himself. And therefore, you subjects of the king are just like children. You have no right to resist him. You have no place in doing so. This book, which is called Patriarcha, gives intellectual ammunition to the supporters of an absolute monarchy. The book is not published right away. It kind of lingers, and Sir Robert Filmer actually dies. But the book is finally published in 1680 during the reign of King Charles I's son, guy by the name of King Charles II, or as I like to refer to him, Chuck Squared. Chuck is much like his father. He's Catholic. He has a son named James, named after his grandfather, and he clashes with Parliament a lot, although not quite as much as his father had, not enough to end up shorter, as you will. For the people who supported him, Filmer's book is a godsend. I mean, it's right out of the Bible, Bill. It's right out of the Bible. God said that the king is the authority, and he's the father. And if the father is the king, then all political authority goes back to Adam, the biblical first man, and is the father of the human race. Therefore, since this authority has passed down through the generations, through Noah, through the patriarchs and princes, eventually it lands in the hands of kings, and kings are therefore chosen by God. And so if you obey the king, you are not just bowing to another man's will, you are obeying the father of all nations, the heir of Adam, the man whom God himself has appointed, and therefore you're being, good for God, and that'll get you into heaven, right? It also, that's the theory anyway, that means that the king's authority is absolute. Kids aren't supposed to argue with their father. Subjects had no right to argue with their kings. Disobedience is not merely rebellion, it's rebellion against God, which is an interesting idea that'll come into play a little bit later. Filmer rejects the idea that people are naturally free or naturally equal. He didn't need to. He wraps this whole thing in the robe of Scripture. He doesn't need to prove that kings had practical authority. He said it's a matter of divine order. And of course, in a country that is ruled by a Catholic, but it's a parliament, Anglican, religion's a big deal. Far bigger than we understand today. We don't really comprehend how much religion plays into this. He holds this as a birthright. It's unchallengeable. It's eternal. Now, to our modern ears, his argument sounds pretty medieval. The giant family tree that stretches all the way back to Eden with every king in Europe claiming descent from Adam. It's a vision that's straight out of, a church window or a mythological tapestry. But it's not realistic to us. But in 1680 England, 100 years before the American Revolution, these arguments held great weight, particularly with those who supported the king. Royalists desperately needed an intellectual foundation for their cause, and they found it in Filmer. Now, during the reign of Charles II and his son, James II, this book, Patriarcha, is brandished as proof that Parliament had no rights to limit the king. that dissent is treason, and that liberty was not a birthright, but a privilege granted or denied by royal favor, which is totally the opposite of what we believe. There were those who feared that England was drifting into a Catholic-style absolutism. In fact, our entire fear of standing armies is based in that religious belief that that's something that the Pope does. You may not like that, but that's true. Here's the irony. By the time Patriarcha is published, its argument is already outdated. England had tasted regicide. They'd already gotten rid of one king, lived under a republic, seen Parliament called the king to account, restored the monarchy, controlled it with Parliament. The idea that the king was simply a father and everyone else is a child was sounding ridiculous. But here's that voice from Filmer saying all this. And in the process of all this, Jefferson, of course, knows all this, as do all the founding fathers. This is not history to them. This is their way. Another man sits down and takes pen to paper and says, all that stuff in Patriarcha, it's nonsense. And he produces more ideas that will inspire Jefferson to write those words.
And we get to those as Bill Mick Live continues on a Tuesday morning with Dave Does History. Dave Bowman and Liberty 250 right here on 92.7 FM WMMB. We continue in moments.
It's a take on history you won't find anywhere else. Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live.
That Dave does, and in this hour brought to you by the McPherson Financial Group. Before we jump back into it, opportunity for you to thank a teacher. You can nominate your favorite teacher at BillMick.com on the contest page, and they could win $5,000 in classroom supplies from Donors Choose and iHeartRadio. One of the teachers nominated locally is Bianca Cantu, Gardendale Separate Day School, where she does special needs work there and showing the kids things and getting them to perform in ways other teachers haven't been able to do. And watching these kids learn to read and count, among other things, has just been gratifying to the people who nominated her. Bianca Cantu, today's Teacher of the Day on WMMB. Back to our teacher of the Tuesdays. It's Dave Bowman with Dave Does History. So, Dave, we're building up to the counter to what Sir Robert Filmer had written about the absolute authority of the monarchy. Tell us what happens.
So when Charles, or as I like to refer to him, Chuck Squared, comes back to the throne, at first everything is great. But the problems quickly reappear. We still have this issue with Protestant England and a Catholic king. Charles II begins to argue with Parliament just like his father did. And over the course of the next few years, he will do the following things. He will try to push religious toleration schemes, which sounds good, but what it really means is he's trying to turn England Catholic. He has a cabal ministry, an infamous group of ministers who pursue policies that smacked of self-interest and foreign intrigue. He creates a secret treaty with the French, Catholic France, against the Dutch, and even promises to convert them to Catholicism at some point. He's really pushing all this. He sells England's foreign policy to Louis XIV, which kind of looks like treason. He creates a standing army. Again, as I said to you before, this is something that Catholic popes do. They have standing armies to suppress the people. That's where that fear comes from for us. He manipulates elections. Well, Parliament won't do what I want him to do, so he starts a thing called rotten boroughs, where he basically buys elections and ensures that the people that he wants in Parliament are there. And then there's this giant thing called the Popish plot, which we don't have time to get into, but it's a giant social media scam, much like the Cracker Barrel thing we talked about earlier, in which we're told that Catholics are doing a thing and everybody should be angry about it. Hundreds of people are arrested, 22 people are executed, and yet the entire thing is a total and complete lie. It's completely made up, and it occurs in England. When Charles II dies and James II takes his throne, James is openly Catholic. He's militantly Catholic. He doesn't hide his faith. He pursues Catholic positions. He puts Catholics in high positions, universities, governments. He defies Parliament's laws that ban them. He starts dispensing and suspending power for laws. He starts ignoring laws that Parliament has passed, specifically the Test Act. He reinforces not just the standing army, but he makes sure that it has Catholic officers. He puts 7 Anglican bishops on trial. We don't have time to go through all this stuff, but they're acquitted and they become national heroes. And then he does the thing that just can't be tolerated, Bill. He has a son. And a son, of course, is an heir to the throne. And a son who is an heir to a Catholic throne is going to be a Catholic. And we can't have that. And so John Locke sits down and he writes what is known as the Second Treatise on Government, primarily to counter Filmer's book and to remind us that, yeah, this isn't how this is going to work. We're not those people.
So Dave, Locke sits down to write this and counter what has been laid out as far as the divine right of kings. Where's he going with it?
John Locke's Second Treatise on Government is almost scripture to the founding fathers, the people that are there in Congress, to Jefferson, to Adams. Now, your average American colonialist probably hasn't read this, but they have these same innate ideas. They understand these things the same way. This is that American understanding, not just of liberty, but of pursuit of happiness as well. But it's Locke that actually puts this in writing in the 1680s. He writes that all men are free and equal. Remember that Filmer had said that, no, you're not born free, you're not equal, you're a subject to a king. Locke's argument is that we're born free, equal, and that we are governed not by a king, but by reason. He really gets into life, liberty, and property. He really likes the right of property. And Locke's position on property is that your right to property comes from your labor, not from a grant from the king. And that's an important distinction because hitherto, with kings and the divine right of kings, you didn't have property unless the king gave it to you. This is how the king bought loyalty. Remember, with his knights and serfs and that sort of thing, he would grant them land grants. And with those grants came what? The people that lived on that land. And now all of a sudden they had to work for that knight or whoever. The king gave that to them. Locke's truly, I wouldn't say radical ideas, but his ideas that very much differed from Filmer and the idea of divine kings was that legitimate government is formed only by social contract, i.e., the consent of the governed. If we don't agree to your government, you don't get to be governor. And we've already proved that once because we took Chuck the First and we made him 4'6" instead of 5'8". We explained to him at the point of an axe that you're not in charge here, we are. He also believed that there should be limits on power. Legislature's supreme, but bound by natural law. Executive held in trust. These are ideas that should sound very familiar to us because this is what we have come to believe, correct? He also argued that what the Parliament had done in the 1640s was correct, that King Charles I had gone too far and it cost him his head. He makes the same argument about James II, who had gone too far, and hence he is replaced on the throne by William and Mary, the stadtholder of the Netherlands, in the Glorious Revolution. We don't have time to go through all that history, but what you need to know is Parliament rose up, passed a law, said, nope, James, you're out of here. Your son will never be king. And we're going to have a law that says only a Protestant can be king. So we got to look around, find somebody who has a claim to the English throne and is Protestant and who will agree to this. Turned out to be James's daughter, who was married to William over in the Netherlands. And so William invades England. They give him the throne. And one of the things that Locke writes are these words. The reason why this is legitimate is because of a, quote, long train of abuses. And therefore we have the right to dissolve James's government. And of course, that's a phrase Jefferson catches on to. And it's a phrase that Benjamin Gates will later in the movie say, that's the heart of what this is all about.
And we dig further into it as we were working our way toward July 4th of 1776, going all the way back to the 1600s to get us started today. And we continue in moments when Dave Does History here on Bill Mick Live. 321-768-1240 if you want to.
Call Bill now. 321-768-1240.
The McPherson Financial Group, this hour sponsor of the program. Dave Bowman with Dave Does History, our Liberty 250 series, as we're looking at what led to the preamble to the Declaration of Independence and where did it all come from. Dave's been citing John Locke's second treatise of government. And Dave, you said Jefferson knew it well, even if general Americans did not, but the founding fathers did.
This is absolutely true. The founding fathers, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, others, when they sat down in 1776 to draft this, Jefferson especially, they're not working in a vacuum. They have been trained in law. They have been steeped in this history. They are steeped in the writings of Locke, Sidney, Montesquieu, the great canon of English constitutional thought. And by the way, there is no English constitution. It is a collection of ideas that everybody has agreed to. But he's also writing this with a specific audience in mind. Yes, the Declaration of Independence is going to be read in Philadelphia. Yes, it's going to be read in New York City. Yes, it's going to be read in Charleston and even Milledgeville. But he knows that the words that he puts on that parchment are also going to be read in London. They're going to be read, probably aloud, in Parliament. And when those words are read, he wants them to sting. And so he writes those words. A long train of abuses and usurpations. And it invents a design. At first glance, this sounds like just good rhetoric. It reads like a flourish, a way of introducing grievances that make up the bulk of the Declaration of Independence that we're going to get into. But to anyone schooled in English politics, English history, all that stuff we just talked about from Chuck I down through James II and William and Mary, this is a phrase that carries deep meaning. It's not new. It comes straight from Locke. Jefferson was lifting that phrase straight out of England's own revolutionary history, echoing the very language that Parliament itself had once used to justify its own resistance to Charles II and James II. To understand the weight of those words, we went back to the 1670s and 1680s and we recited all those long train of abuses and usurpations that Charles II and James I had committed, that Locke calls a train of abuses. It surfaced again under James II. This whole idea of the Catholicism and trying to take over the throne. Again, to us, it might seem trite, but in the 1680s, this was absolutely the most important political point in the world. It's this logic, this idea of this long train of abuses and usurpations that justifies the glorious revolution of 1688, when Parliament, that's right, the Whigs, stood up and said, hey, William of Orange, husband of Mary, claimant to the throne, why don't you invade our country, and when you win, we will declare the throne vacant, and we will make you the king. The justification was not a sudden rebellion. It was that James had forfeited his right to rule by this sustained train of abuses. He had placed himself in a state of war with his people, dissolving the contract that bound them to him. It was Locke's language, but it was also Whig rhetoric long before Locke put it in his book. Now, when we fast forward to Philadelphia, Jefferson takes up the quill, and he uses that very phrase. He sets it at the heart of his indictment. Yes, King George is the one being indicted, a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, inventing a design to reduce us under absolute despotism. Those are not random words. They're not merely decorative. They are deliberate. Jefferson is reminding the world, and especially Parliament, that we were standing on the very same ground, the very same principles that those in Parliament had once stood upon themselves. We talked in the first hour about, being misled by anger. We talked in the second hour about Antonin Scalia and the fact that he stood for what was right. These words that were given to the Whigs in 1776 in our Declaration of Independence were holding a mirror up to the Whigs. Look, do you believe what you said yourself, what you say you believe, or have you become that which you swore to destroy? It was a challenge that they could not easily answer, for their very words that they held sacred were turned against them. They had once denounced the Stuart kings with the same words, and now they either have to condemn the Americans for doing what they themselves had done and celebrated less than a century earlier, or they had to acknowledge that it's a dagger turned inwards, exposing their own hypocrisy. This is the subtle genius of Jefferson's rhetoric. It's not just Lockean philosophy, though his fingerprints are everywhere through the preamble. It's Whig rhetoric, Whig, W-H-I-G, weaponized against the Whigs themselves. Jefferson saying, you taught us this, you fought for this, you bled for this, and now we claim the exact same right, and you try to brand us as rebels? You can't have it both ways. Either you're rebels, or we're all rebels, or none of us are. Considering the structure of the Declaration's argument, Jefferson begins with those first principles: equality, natural right, government by the consent. It's a Lockean foundation. But then he pivots to history, the long train of abuses that proves the design. This is Whig logic, English logic. It's Parliament's own argument. And then he turns to the judgment. And when such design is evident, the people not only have the right, but the duty to throw off such government. The same exact conclusion that Parliament had once reached in 1688. By using the very words of the Whigs, Jefferson is binding the American cause to English tradition. He's saying, in effect, we're not inventing revolution. We're not borrowing it from the French. We are walking the same path you walked down. We are the real Englishmen. We are defending real, true English rights. It matters because Jefferson's declaration was meant to do more than just declare independence. It's meant to persuade. It's meant to influence. We need allies. We've got to explain to them why we're doing it. We need legitimacy in the eyes of our own people, many of whom still think of themselves as loyal subjects of the crown. But wait a minute. Remember that Parliament is what we are supposed to be rooting for. And by burying the American case in English history, Jefferson gives it credibility. He shows that resistance to George III isn't just a radical break. It is the very definition of English liberty. The irony, of course, is that George III, it really isn't James II. English historians will remind us of this, that he wasn't. He wasn't in trying to impose Catholicism. Although, if you recall, there was some argument that with the Quebec Act, he was trying to. He didn't dissolve Parliament. He didn't necessarily ignore laws. In fact, that was part of our complaint, is that he didn't ignore the laws that we thought were unconstitutional. He was, in fact, more limited by Parliament than the Stuarts have ever been. But that hardly mattered, because the pattern was the same: taxation without representation, standing armies in peacetime, governors ruling without assemblies, charters revoked, trade restrictions, petitions ignored. Each grievance on its own might be tolerable and might be sufferable, while evils are sufferable. But taken together, they form a pattern, a long train of abuses and usurpations that point to a single design. That was Locke's argument, it was Parliament's argument, and now it's our argument. And that's why that phrase is more than just rhetoric. It's at the heart. It's the hinge between the English and the American revolutions. It's the thread that connects the regicide of Charles I, the exile of James II, and the Declaration of Independence from George III. It turns the preamble into a transatlantic echo chamber, bouncing the words of the Whigs right back at them and reminding them that tyranny is tyranny no matter what century and no matter what continent. When Jefferson wrote that line, a long train of abuses and usurpations, he's not merely accusing George III. He's accusing Parliament of betraying their own creed, of forgetting their own words. And he was telling the world that America had not invented liberty, but inherited it, and that the Revolution of 1776 was the rightful child of the Revolution of 1688.
And we continue in a minute on Bill Mick Live. Dave, you know what I like about this is that Jefferson used as precedent of English history to justify the U.S. making these claims and breaking away, not as rogue colonists, but as Englishmen themselves. And we have a right to this because it's what you've done. It's what we've done. I think that was brilliant.
It's an amazing example to me of, if you know your history, you know your arguments. You want to know why you study history? That's why. It doesn't have anything to do with repeating the past. It has to do with understanding why things happen. And this is my concern today, is how many people, even in this audience, could even give you a general outline of why the English Revolution occurred, the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And yet our own country's founding is literally steeped in that.
Yeah, rooted in it. Yeah.
So little understanding of it.
Well, and that's why I think what you do with us here on these Tuesdays is so valuable, because it's a look that we didn't get in our history classes in school. We didn't get, if we pursued it any further. We're getting it now, and we're getting a look that, at least for me, makes me appreciate all of this history so much more. And Dave, I appreciate all the work you put into it, because I know it's a love of yours, but it's also a labor that you have to go through to get there.
Especially this morning, it's hot. And we're just scratching the surface. There's so much more out there that you could read, study, and get to know and begin to understand. Why is there a United States? Well, it starts long before 1760.
Yeah, it sure does. And we will continue further with Liberty 250 next week in our 8 o'clock hour on a Tuesday. That'll be our first day back next week after the Labor Day holiday. Thank you to McPherson Financial Group for bringing you this hour. Tomorrow, a wide open Wednesday. Take us where you like. Dave, thank you. We'll see you next week.
Check out more stories from history at davedoeshistory.org.